Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Denis, and I'm the Director of Sustainability at Pulse Canada. For those who didn't participate last week, it's a quick intro for myself. I've been working at Pulse Canada for 10 years. My area of specialty is in environmental sustainability and environmental impacts of agriculture. In the past, I've worked more so on the farm side with producers, but now I focus a lot on producing data and substantiating the environmental benefits of pulse crops and how we can relate that to improving the environmental footprint of food and food systems. So today we're continuing with part 2 of our mini webinar series, talking about how reformulation can make a big impact in achieving your sustainability goals and how pulses in particular can have an impact on that. So quickly, before we begin, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording today's session and circulating the recording with all registrants afterwards by email. We reserved a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions, and you can submit your questions at any time by using the Q&A box in your control panel to type them in, which should be at the top of your screen. If you're having any technical issues, feel free to use the chat box to send us a message. So with that, we'll get started. During the last presentation, I highlighted the fact that agriculture has a major impact on environmental outcomes and environmental impacts globally. In some cases, it's the majority of the impacts that we see from all industries come from agriculture. So if that's the case, like land use and freshwater use. And for things like greenhouse gas emissions that people are talking about all the time these days, it's about 26% or 24% of emissions. And the important piece to talk about here is that the supply chain with transportation and packaging and processing typically has a smaller component of the emissions that we see from the from food production systems. The majority of emissions actually come from the farm. They come from producing crops for feed and for human consumption. They come from producing livestock and fish within aquaculture systems. And they also come from the conversion of land from forests and other natural systems to produce food. Because converting those natural ecosystems produces a lot of emissions just naturally. So there's a real opportunity to re-look at how do we produce food, what type of foods we produce, for example, and reduce the amount of emissions we have within our systems themselves. And a good example of this is the fact that on those farm production systems, different foods have different impacts. When we're producing livestock products, we typically see quite a bit higher emissions and impacts than we do for plant-based products. And in particular, pulses have a very low footprint. So there's opportunities to reformulate livestock-based products to reduce emissions, but there's also opportunities to reformulate cereal and plant-based products as well to achieve corporate and sustainability goals. And when we look at this reformulation approach, we really have to take a look at that whole food system. You can't just focus at the farm level, because what you do at the farm level may have impacts downstream, such as in transportation, if you're importing an ingredient that comes from further away or domestically. You can reformulate and address issues of formulation and processing. You can actually improve your marketing through reformulation by having a product that is better linked to what consumers are asking for. And you can also affect things like how it's cooked at home and prepared, and even potentially waste at several stages across that supply chain. So we need to take a look at reformulation from the aspect of this whole scope. And when we look at life cycle assessment, for example, this is what we do. A good example to look at here is an old LCA that Barilla put together for pasta from about 2012. And they've been doing this work for a long time, but this older work actually showed, and it continues to show, that the raw material cultivation at the farm has the most impact. So reducing emissions at the farm is one piece, but also what we are producing at the farm also has a major component and can really reduce the emissions we see of the total product. Because in this case for pasta, things like milling, packaging, processing, and distribution really have a low impact. And really, when we talk about reformulation and impacts of environmental, on the environmental side, pulses have a real potential. We're seeing a lot of increase in product launches with pulses, and a lot of this is in the reformulation space. And we're seeing innovative products being launched across the spectrum, whether it's be in bakery and snacks, or it be in reformulated meat products, or even vegetarian products and vegan products. We're seeing all kinds of new applications. And in this case, there's real potential to leverage the environmental benefits of pulses to show that these products may or may not have a decreased environmental footprint. So how do we do that? Pulse Canada has been leading some work in this space for a while now. Since 2018, we've been really publishing and doing research on the reformulation aspect of including pulse ingredients in different food products. And this was really one of the first ones that we did. We focused on 3 wheat-based products, and we conducted a study with ETH, which is a research institution in Zurich, Switzerland. And we looked at basically a reformulation aspect of these 3 wheat-based products: pan bread, breakfast cereal, and pasta, with a formulation suggested by the Canadian International Grains Institute, based on some research they had conducted that looked at the palatability and functionality of including pulse ingredients into these 3 food products. So as you can see, the pan bread has the least amount of pure lentil flour within it. The breakfast cereal has the most amount in terms of that reformulation, and pasta is in the middle with 30%. When we conducted the life cycle assessment, we were able to collect data specific to the production systems that we were sourcing our materials from. So wheat and peas, we were able to collect information at the time on yields, fertilizer inputs and pesticide inputs, seed inputs, fuel use for field operations, and also the right modeling to reflect our environmental conditions that produce emissions like greenhouse gas emissions, one being nitrous oxide. We also collected information on flour milling, the amount of water, electricity, and waste produced when we mill these products. And we collected information as well from research on the impacts of food processing, them being different for obviously baked goods like bread, pasta, and breakfast cereal. And when we look at the impacts of reformulation on these products, we see a benefit to reformulation where we're reducing the emissions of all 3 products, as the pea flour or the lentil flour has a much lower footprint than a wheat flour. If we source both of these flours from Western Canada in terms of grain, we know that pulses have a lower footprint than those wheat flours. But what we also see is that there's a difference in the amount of benefit we have based on the product that we're looking at. So for pan bread, we saw the lowest amount of incorporation rate, and we see the lowest amount of potential benefit on the greenhouse gas side. For pasta, we see the opposite. We see the most amount of we see the most amount of benefit, but actually it's only a moderate amount of flour. And for breakfast cereal is a bit of the anomaly here, where for some reason we see less environmental benefit to a high incorporation of breakfast of flour. And I'll explain that just now here. The reason being is that for pan bread and pasta, the majority of the emissions that we see for carbon come from the cultivation stage. So the farm production system is producing most of those emissions. And so the potential to reduce emissions is higher because we're using a product that has pea flour that has a lot lower impact than the wheat flour. But for breakfast cereal, it's an anomaly in the case that the manufacturing stage actually has the majority of the emissions. So the potential to reduce the total emissions of the product is less for breakfast cereal than it is for these other 2 products. And that's because in our case, we assumed that the manufacturing process was the same, whether it was reformulated or not, based on the available data that we had. But it's an important thing to consider is, well, what product are we reformulating and what's the potential to reduce those emissions due to that reformulation? And they are not all, basically the take home here is not all products are going to be the same. Some other work that I've been able to conduct just recently was taking a look at, well, what's the impact of actually reformulating different food products? This being pasta as an example. If it was a base formulation of wheat versus rice versus corn, we're seeing gluten-free pastas being produced from corn with corn or from rice. There's potential to reformulate these as well. And what I want to put you, the takeaway here is really that if you're reformulating something like wheat, there's potential to decrease the footprint of that pasta. But really, at the end of the day, if you have a product that is formulated with rice, you see really large decreases in emissions when we reformulate them, and that's because rice is an irrigated product that produces a lot of emissions when we're producing rice and has a high footprint. And so if you got a corporate goal around reducing emissions for your company in terms of total emissions, there's a real high potential to reach goals by reformulating rice-based products with pulses. All three have benefits, but the amount of emissions that we can actually reduce as a company really is different between the three. So that's another important characteristic around reformulating, something to consider. Another piece of work that we've been focused on lately is looking at livestock production systems here in North America and specifically in Western Canada, where we commonly use peas as a feed ingredient. Just like we see in human nutrition, we can recognize in the livestock production systems that peas are valuable from a complementary protein standpoint. They're a local feed ingredient. They provide some nutrition and it can be cost effective when prices are right. And the other thing we know is that peas have the potential to reduce carbon footprint of meat products because peas tend to have a lower footprint than the competing ingredients, like which I'll show a little later. And some studies have demonstrated this in the past, but they haven't really dug in very deeply. The other component we see is that there's real potential to market these food products from a sustainability standpoint, because we already see segmentation in that marketplace. We go down the aisle, we see lots of segmentation with natural, omega-3, pasture-raised, organic, and there's likely some room for a low carbon meat product in the marketplace as well, based on what we're seeing today. When we look at the impact of ingredients, we see peas having a lower footprint than competing ingredients that we use in livestock production. We use a lot of wheat and barley grain, barley for feeding livestock in Western Canada. We don't use as much corn. We also use a lot of soybean meal and canola meal as protein sources, and all of those ingredients have higher carbon footprints than peas. So there's real potential to use peas to decrease emissions. When we conducted the study with a company called Groupe Pageco, which is a consultancy in Quebec that focuses a lot on, has conducted lots of life cycle assessments for livestock products in Canada, we were able to see that when we included peas in the ration, we were able to decrease the footprint of these feeds by a substantial amount. For swine, it was a 28% reduction in the carbon footprint of the feed. And for egg layers, we were able to reduce it by 13%. There's less impacts on the layer side, just because we're able to use we aren't able to use as much peas in that ration as you would see in the swine side, just because of the way layers require a certain amount of energy in that system. The other piece of background I want to provide here is that we worked with Western Canadian researchers that focus on livestock production and livestock nutrition to help us formulate diets and build the model around this assessment. So we're able to really reflect the realities of the system we have today. And the last component here of this study I wanted to highlight is that the LCA actually showed a really strong impact on peas, including peas in the ration, on the carbon footprint of pork produced from that system. We saw an 18% reduction in the pork when we included peas in the feed. And that's something that's pretty substantial and something that a company could use to highlight and develop a line of low carbon pork potentially. Another piece of work that we focused on with the same researcher we worked on at ETH in Zurich in Switzerland was the potential to lower the environmental footprint and improve the nutritional impact of beef burgers that are reformulated with lentil puree. This is a product that's being marketed today by our counterparts at lentils.org in the US and in the retail sector. And what we found was that there's improvements across the board, whether they be environmental, whether they be nutritional, or whether they be cost. This formulation really has a triple win. We call it the kind of the triple bottom line aspect of sustainability, where all the environmental indicators were decreased with basically in line with the same amount of percentage as we see with the incorporation rate. And that really has to do with the fact that beef and other livestock products have a quite high environmental footprint compared to the pulse ingredient that we're incorporating. So we're basically able to displace all of those environmental impacts that we see from the livestock production with that lentil puree. We also saw improvements in other aspects of nutrition, such as fat and fiber contents that were improved. And when we dig in a little bit, we also see some components that we need to consider here. So the source of the beef, for example, reformulated with Saskatchewan lentils really has an impact. As you can see, when you reformulate Canadian beef, you see the same 33% reduction than if you're reformulating US beef. But the US beef in terms of water and carbon impacts are higher than we see in the US than in Canada, sorry. And from the water side, the reason why is that the US beef system relies more heavily on irrigated grain and feed production. And that's demonstrated here within the study, where we are able to collect data from a Canadian life cycle assessment and a US life cycle assessment and make this comparison. So at the end of the day, this is something that you need to consider. You don't want to use global generic data ever. When you're conducting these type of assessments, you really want to be specific to the system as much as possible and collect the best data as possible. The other thing that we consider when we do this type of work is the type of model we apply. And in water, it can be really important because the context of using water in one location is not the same context as you would see somewhere else. So this is a model actually that was developed for the United Nations Environmental Program by a Canadian. Madame Boulay, I think is her name. She's from Quebec originally. And really what it does is it takes a look at water use compared to the amount of water that's available in the system and how much competing uses there are in the system. So really it's an indicator of risk of water use rather than just the use of water in general. And I like to use the context of rice production in the US, because it's a good example to kind of highlight the differences here. When we see rice production in the US, there's two major regions. One is in the Mississippi Valley of the southern US, and the other one is in the California growing region where they're irrigating in both regions. But that irrigation context is very different. In the Mississippi Valley, there's lots of water. We see this blue polygon here, which represents that the competing uses of water and the amount of water available are very high. So the risk of water use there for rice production is low. But if you're sourcing rice from California, it's a whole other story. Lots of competing uses for water, and using water in this context has a very different story. So I just want to highlight that as the type of data that we need to make these comparisons is really, if we want to tell the right story and the true story, you have to really dig. And it's the same thing for pulses, for example, here. If I look at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprints of peas across the prairies, it actually changes quite a bit. For something that's really low, we see some variability. And so we want to ensure that we're collecting and utilizing data as much as possible from the growing region that we're sourcing. And in this case, the majority of Canadian peas are being grown in these regional units of 24, 28, 29, and 30. In 29 and 30, we see these really low footprints, and that has to do with the fact that the farmers in that region are using practices that help sequester carbon, but more importantly, emissions from those two regional units, which are in southern Saskatchewan and southern Alberta. It's a cool, dry climate, and those really reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with crop protection, in particular nitrous oxide. So this is the type of data that we're really able to capture in Canada and really able to leverage, which gives us a bit of an advantage in Canada compared to a lot of other regions. And that's the type of information we've been able to collect in our own life cycle assessment and publish for Canadian peas. So we're able to regionalize that data, tell the story of one ecosystem versus another ecosystem, share that information with the supply chain, and really ensure that we reflect as accurately as possible the growing conditions and also the farm practices of those specific regions. So this is something I'm going to be highlighting a lot more in the next session that we have coming up next week. But we're going to focus more so on the data to back up your story. How do we build transparency within our food story of sustainability? And how do we bring this to the next level? We know that a lot of companies are starting to focus on ingredients for pulses. And that's kind of the next step is, well, we've got data on crops, and what can we do in Canada to help build a narrative and build a data set around ingredients as well. And then how can that impact the story that we have within the food products themselves? So I'll be highlighting that next week. But right now, I think it's time for me to wrap this up a little bit. I'd love to take some questions. A reminder, if you'd like to submit one, just type your question into the Q&A box at the top of the screen. So right now, I've got a few questions I can answer, and I'm going to go to them right now if I can. And I can't seem to open up the box, Mary. Oh, I got it. Okay. So I got the first question is, what are the barriers to using peas in feed? Is it simply cost-based? Is the nutrition for the animal the same? I used to work in the livestock sector actually, and I've got people, close friends that are still nutritionists in the sector. So when it comes to the nutrition, really at the end of the day, what a nutritionist does, an animal nutritionist does, is they always balance the diet. And so there's a balance of cost versus the potential nutrition of a product when they're incorporating it in. The other barrier is basically availability of a product. Is there a lot available? So you have to consider both nutrition and cost to this as well. And recently, this recent price of the spike in pulses really is kind of limiting the amount of peas we use in feed, but traditionally we use probably about 300 to 500,000 tons of peas in feed applications in Western Canada every year. So there's another question here or comment. Interesting data on the blend. Would the goal be to provide an off-the-shelf lentil beef burger, or is this something people would be making on their own at home? And what is the impact on taste? My understanding of that work is really focused on the potential to produce products within a retail setting. So there's the real potential there could be for a company to produce some lentil puree within the restaurant or within the food service facility and blend it right there. When it comes to taste, that's good. That's a good question. I think there's been I've actually made some lentil blended burgers at home myself, and I can't really tell the difference between using that product or using a wheat crumb, for example. And even blending at a higher rate doesn't seem to impact the taste as well. And actually some performance that I understand, some performance on things like the amount of fat that's retained within a product can actually change as well with the amount of lentils. I'm not the expert on that one, that's for sure though. I have another question here. What kind of impact would replacing soybean protein with pea protein would mean for a burger? Would the environmental story change drastically? And that's the question that I really really going to dig into more so next week. Right now, we don't really know. There's been I think what we really need to see is some more research conducted on what is the actual impact of one process versus another when it comes to fractionation. And then again, we have to compare with good data on the soybean side. So this is something I'm going to speak to a bit next week. We're seeing some new publications coming out looking at pea protein ingredients and other ingredients. But there's a real potential to have a positive story from a Canadian standpoint here, because I mentioned earlier, if we're talking about the production system we have a very low impact production system for peas in Western Canada. Our environmental conditions really produce low greenhouse gas emissions, and we can leverage that within the peas that we're producing and marketing, and the ingredients we're marketing from our systems based in Western Canada. You mentioned Canada. Is this data specific to Canada or applicable across all pulse crops no matter the region? Is the next question we're seeing here. It is really specific to Canada. You can't really take the data that we produce from our life cycle assessments and attribute them elsewhere. We are able to build up that data set within Canada and highlight our production region as much as possible. And you can't really grab that and make an assumption that peas grown in another region, whether it be the US or especially Europe, is the same. We know that, for example, the European peas grown in France or in Germany or in Western Europe are grown in much wetter conditions. And that would be much more conducive to more greenhouse gas emissions than what we would see in Western Canada. So the answer is no. So with that, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm also seeing that we're getting pretty close to time. So I'm going to wrap it up here. So thanks everybody for joining, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody next week. So thanks again.